I don't believe that we should be highlighting these differences with the intent to draw a line in the sand and give up on the process of trying to understand one another, as many influential figures would have us do. I believe that these differences should be highlighted for the purpose outlined here, to understand our roots. Alright, so it's generally understood that men and women are different, right? Most of us tend to agree that there are obvious objective disparities between the two sexes when it comes to our physical statures and capabilities, our psychological processes, our emotional responses, and our behaviors and mannerisms. Now, of course, the notion that men and women are essentially the same in virtually every way, except maybe reproductively, has become more and more popular over the last few years. But for the most part, the majority of us still believe that there are significant differences between the sexes. But as to the question of why men and women exhibit these differences, the answer isn't quite as unanimously agreed upon. Surveys conducted by the Pew Research Center reveal that there is no consensus on whether these disparities are a result of inherent differences in our natures or prescribed differences in our nurturing. As we can see from the surveys, when asked whether men and women are basically the same or basically different when it comes to how we express our feelings, our physical abilities, our hobbies and interests, and our approaches to parenting, most seem to conclude that we are in fact more dissimilar than we are similar. But when asked whether these differences were a result of biological factors or societal pressure, the majority of respondents seem to believe that societal pressure held the lion's share of responsibility for these differences. And apparently, these responses were split across gender lines. The survey revealed that women generally attribute these differences to societal expectations, while men tend to attribute them to biological factors. And personally, I think that there is a very understandable reason why men and women feel that our differences stem from separate origins. But we'll touch on that later. For now, I'll just say that when I saw the results of this survey, I was honestly a little taken aback. Because, full disclosure, I actually pretty accurately reflect the results of this survey, in that I am a man and I believe that biological factors play a significant role in determining our behaviors. Now, obviously, I don't believe that this is a case of either or. In my video about human nature, I referenced the fact that most psychologists agree that it is the combination of nature and nurture that determines individual behaviors. And so I figured that this combination also applied to the topic of sex differences in behaviors as well. And so I wouldn't feel comfortable asserting that the differences between the sexes are entirely a result of biological dissimilarities. But I do believe that biological differences are a key component of the equation, if not the most important component. But according to this survey, it would seem that the majority of the population believes that societal expectations are the primary cause for these differences, if not the only cause. And so I have to admit that this belief does conflict with my worldview. And so because of this discrepancy, I decided to take a deep dive into this topic to see if my personal beliefs could hold up to the scrutiny, or completely fall apart in the face of insurmountable evidence. And if you've watched any of my videos before, then you probably already know where this is going. As always, I found that there is truth and validity on both sides of this argument. Yes, I did manage to find very compelling evidence that supports my current worldview, but of course, there is a substantial amount of legitimate evidence that refutes it as well. And so the objective here is to reconcile all of this information so as to have a more accurate perception of this issue that ultimately reflects the truth. But with all that said, let's just get into the discussion. So in my investigation, one of the first studies that I came across was this May 2017 article published in the Stanford Medicine magazine titled "Two Minds: The Cognitive Differences Between Men and Women." The article references several studies undertaken by researchers that corroborate the claim that male and female brains function differently. And just a quick side note, a lot of the onus for proving biological differences is placed on establishing dimorphism between the male and female brain. Obviously, hormones and other biological factors play a large part in this discussion as well, but from what I've personally seen, the main battle on this topic is being fought over the claim that there is an inherent difference between the male and female brain. So that is where this video is going to place the majority of its focus as well. In any case, one such study was conducted by Dr. Diane Halpern, acclaimed psychologist, researcher, author, and former president of the American Psychological Association. And take note of her former job title because this is going to come up a bit later in this discussion. In her preface to the first edition of her academic text, Sex Differences in Cognitive Abilities, Halpern wrote, "At the time, it seemed clear to me that any between-sex differences in thinking abilities were due to socialization practices, artifacts and mistakes in the research, and bias and prejudice. After reviewing a pile of journal articles that stood several feet high and numerous books and book chapters that dwarfed the stack of journal articles, I changed my mind." And the reason Halpern changed her mind was because there was too much data pointing to the biological basis of sex-based cognitive differences to ignore. And this data extends beyond the scope of human biology. In a study of 34 rhesus monkeys, for example, males strongly preferred toys with wheels over plush toys, toys, whereas females found plush toys likable. It would be tough to argue that the monkey's parents bought them sex-type toys or that simian society encourages its male offspring to play more with trucks. But obviously, we are not rhesus monkeys, so what does the data have to say about human children? A much more recent study established that boys and girls 9 to 17 months old, an age when children show few, if any, signs of recognizing either their own or other children's sex, nonetheless show marked differences in their preference for stereotypically male versus stereotypically female toys. But these differences aren't only observed in the toy preferences of children who haven't yet been subjected to sex-based societal pressures. There are significant differences in our perceptive tendencies as well. Halpern explains that you see sex differences in spatial visualization ability in 2 and 3-month-old infants. Infant girls respond more readily to faces and begin talking earlier. Boys react earlier in infancy to experimentally induced perceptual discrepancies in their visual environment. In adulthood, women remain more oriented to faces, men to things. And these observed differences, devoid of any societal or cultural influence, result in some dimorphic predispositions. These findings have all been replicated, Halpern claims. Women excel in several measures of verbal ability, pretty much all of them except for verbal analogies. Women's reading comprehension and writing ability consistently exceed that of men on average. They outperform men in tests of fine motor coordination and perceptual speed. They're more adept at retrieving information from long-term memory. Men, on average, can more easily juggle items in working memory. They have superior visuospatial skills. They're better at visualizing what happens when a complicated 2- or 3-dimensional shape is rotated in space, at correctly determining angles from the horizontal, at tracking movement objects, and at aiming projectiles. Now, these studies focused on very young children and animals in order to demonstrate that cultural and societal influences couldn't have played a significant role in determining these differences. But as I mentioned earlier, much of the debate around biological differences centers around the analysis of the brain. And regarding this subject, the article references a separate study conducted by Dr. Larry Cahill, a professor of neurobiology and behavior at UC Irvine. In 2000, Cahill scanned the brains of men and women viewing either highly aversive films or emotionally neutral ones. Activity in the amygdala during the viewing experience, as expected, predicted subjects' later ability to recall the viewed clips. But in women, this relationship was observed only in the left amygdala. In men, it was only in the right amygdala. Cahill believes that discoveries like this one should ring researchers' alarm buzzers. Women, it's known, retain stronger, more vivid memories of emotional events than men do. They recall emotional memories more quickly, and the ones they recall are richer and more intense. If, as is likely, the amygdala figures into depression or anxiety, any failure to separately analyze men's and women's brains to understand their different susceptibilities to either syndrome would be as self-defeating as not knowing left from right. Perhaps this could explain why women are twice as likely as men to experience clinical depression in their lifetimes. Likewise for post-traumatic stress disorder. While on the opposite end of the spectrum, men are twice as likely to become alcoholic or drug dependent, and 40% more likely to develop schizophrenia. Boys' dyslexia rate is perhaps 10 times that of girls, and they're 4 or 5 times more likely to get a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So it would seem that the biological differences observed in the functioning of our brains could play a significant role in helping to explain our sex-based genetic predispositions to certain illnesses and conditions. So why isn't it possible that these same biological differences could play a significant role in helping to explain our sex-based genetic predispositions to certain behaviors and mannerisms? Because as Cahill explains, to some appreciable degree, these brain differences have to translate to behavioral differences. Numerous studies show that they do, sometimes with medically meaningful implications. And thus the article concludes, the neuroscience literature shows that the human brain is a sex-typed organ, with distinct anatomical differences in neural structures and accompanying physiological differences in function. So that's it, right? End of discussion. Clearly, the research shows that biological factors explain not only the differences in our behaviors, but also the differences in our cognitive abilities, as well as our sex-based predispositions to certain illnesses and conditions. Cool. So the biological factors argument is obviously the correct answer, right? Well, unfortunately for me, and seemingly a whole bunch of other men, the discussion doesn't really end there, because the next article I came across was actually a report from the American Psychological Association titled Men and Women, No Big Difference. And this article is interesting because it not only refutes the findings from the Stanford Medicine article that we just read, it also refutes the results of the Pew Research Center survey that started this whole discussion in the first place. Because this article claims that men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, cognitive ability, and leadership. But of course, according to the survey, if emotional expression and personal interest are components of one's personality, then it would seem that most people tend to agree that we aren't in fact basically alike in this regard, as this article suggests. And of course, when it comes to cognitive abilities, the Stanford Medicine article went into explicit detail highlighting our differences in that regard. Nevertheless, this article argues that these perceived differences are simply a result of societal pressures and influences. And in order to make this argument, the article references the work of Dr. Janet Hyde, a professor of psychology and gender and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Dr. Hyde found that in studies designed to eliminate gender norms, researchers demonstrated that gender roles and social context strongly determine a person's actions. For example, after participants in one experiment were told that they would not be identified as male or female, nor did they wear any identification, none conformed to stereotypes about their sex when given the chance to be aggressive. In fact, they did the opposite of what would be expected. Women were more aggressive and men were more passive. She also focused on media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different, and how these depictions appear to perpetuate misconception. When it comes to personal relationships, best-selling books and popular magazines often claim that women and men don't get along because they communicate too differently. Hyde suggests instead that men and women stop talking prematurely because they have been led to believe that they can't change supposedly innate sex-based traits. Dr. Hyde also notes that across the dozens of studies, gender differences had either no or a very small effect on most of the psychological variables examined. Only a few main differences appeared. Compared with women, men could throw farther, were more physically aggressive, masturbated more, and held more positive attitudes about sex in uncommitted relationships. And I have to concede that at least some of this is very compelling evidence, specifically the studies demonstrating that gender roles and social context strongly determine a person's actions. Although these studies don't directly refute the research into the effects that biological factors have on our behaviors, they absolutely do confirm the extremely powerful influence that gender roles have on individuals from both sexes. And I also have to agree that insofar as innate sex differences are used as an excuse to stifle communication, empathy, and understanding between men and women, the mainstream discourse around inherent biological differences can be, and actually has been, harmful. But I do have to admit that the alleged main differences between men and women that Hyde alluded to here made me a little suspicious. I found it extremely hard to believe that these were the only primary differences between men and women observed across multiple studies. And also, why are all of these differences centered around the perceptually negative traits associated with men? Really, the only differences you could find between male and female personalities was that men are more aggressive and more open to casual sex? Compared to the differences outlined in the Stanford Medicine article, if I'm being honest, these differences felt a little biased. But in any case, I decided to check the cited research to see if any of these claims held up. And as you can imagine, the results were interesting. This voyeur analysis into the sex differences in spatial abilities revealed that several tests showed significant differences between the sexes. The Feingold investigation into gender differences in personality concluded that males were found to be more assertive and had slightly higher self-esteem than females, while females were higher than males in extroversion, anxiety, trust, and especially tender-mindedness, or for example, nurturance. But also, in support of Dr. Hyde's analysis, the research showed there were no noteworthy sex differences in social anxiety, impulsiveness, activity, ideas, or for example, reflectiveness, locus of control, and orderliness. Archer's analysis of the sex differences in aggression in real-world settings found that direct, especially physical, aggression was more common in males and females at all ages sampled, was consistent across cultures, and occurred from early childhood on, showing a peak between 20 and 30 years. The overall pattern indicated males' greater use of costly methods of aggression rather than a threshold difference in anger. Interestingly, this conclusion supports Hyde's assertion that there are actually fewer differences between the sexes than previously believed, but it also calls into question her claim that a key difference between men and women is men's heightened levels of physical aggression, because the very study that was used to make this claim clearly stated otherwise. And remember when I said to take note of Dr. Halpern's previous ties with the American Psychological Association? Well, aside from the fact that she was at one point the president of the organization that is now publishing reports that directly contradict her own research, one of the studies that this article references, bafflingly enough, is Dr. Halpern's research. This same Dr. Halpern who changed her mind because there was too much evidence pointing to the biological basis of sex-based cognitive differences to ignore. And this particular study from Halpern referenced in this article concluded that females and males show different average patterns of academic achievement and scores on cognitive ability tests, suggesting that there are in fact differences in our cognitive functioning. Females obtain higher grades in school, score much higher on tests of writing and content area tests on which the questions are similar to material that was learned in school. Males score higher on standardized tests of mathematics and science that are not directly tied to their school curriculum, show a large advantage on visual spatial tests, especially those that involve judgments of velocity and navigation through three-dimensional space, and are much more knowledgeable about geography and politics. So it would appear that even the studies that this article uses to make its claim that men and women are basically necessarily the same, in reality suggests that there are significant differences between the sexes beyond men's ability to throw farther and their being more open to casual sex. And so I just found it strange that those were the differences that this article decided to focus on, especially when there were so many other available examples. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, this article doesn't really attempt to debunk the biological factors argument, as much as it just tries to highlight the undeniable role that gender roles and social context play in determining our behaviors, as well as the potential harm that the biological factors argument could inflict, regardless of whether or not the argument is actually true. But there are plenty of studies that directly challenge the biological factors argument by refuting the claims that there are inherent differences between the male and female brain. In my research, I came across several articles from a neuroscientist named Dr. Lisa Elliott. Dr. Elliott is a professor of neuroscience at the Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science, and she has conducted extensive research into the alleged differences between the male and female brain. Since the dawn of MRI, neuroscientists have worked ceaselessly to find differences between men's and women's brains. This research attracts lots of attention because it's just so easy to try to link any particular brain finding to some gender difference in behavior. But as a neuroscientist long experienced in the field, I recently completed a painstaking analysis of 30 years of research on human brain sex differences. And what I found, with the help of excellent collaborators, is that virtually none of these claims has proven reliable. Dr. Elliott continues, except for the simple difference in size, there are no meaningful differences between men's and women's brain structure or activity that holds up across diverse populations. Nor do any of the alleged brain differences actually explain the familiar but modest differences in personality and abilities between men and women. And I was able to find studies from the National Institutes of Health that indirectly corroborate her claims. In a separate study, researchers compared the anatomical findings of the sex differences in the brain with data from more than 11,000 neuroimaging studies. Of 50 cognitive categories, only 5 were associated with anatomical differences, suggesting that differences in the anatomy of the male and female brain aren't necessarily responsible for differences in cognition or behavior. And even the studies that support the biological factors argument at least partially confirmed Dr. Elliott's findings. In the UK, researchers led by psychologist Stuart Ritchie used MRI to scan the brains of 2,750 women and 2,466 men in order to determine differences in brain anatomy. Adjusting for age, on average, they found that women tended to have significantly thicker cortices than men. Thicker cortices have been associated with higher scores on a variety of cognitive and general intelligence tests. Meanwhile, men had higher brain volumes than women in every subcortical region they looked at. And so again, we see that anatomically speaking, on average, there is a difference between the male and female brain, and that these differences have impacts on our cognition and behaviors. And so this research at least partially refutes Dr. Elliott's assertions. However, the article continues. Despite the study's consistent sex-linked patterns, the researchers also found considerable overlap between men and women in brain volume and cortical thickness, just as you might find in height. In other words, just by looking at the brain scan or height of someone plucked at random from the study, researchers would be hard-pressed to say whether it came from a man or woman. That suggests both sexes' brains are far more similar than they are different. So that's it, right? End of discussion. Clearly, the data confirms that there are some slight differences in male-female brain anatomy, but that those differences are mostly negligible and don't actually influence cognition or behavior to a significant degree, right? Well, fortunately for me and my worldview, no, that isn't the end of the discussion, because these studies all focus on differences in brain anatomy, not function. And while I felt it necessary to include this research in this discussion in order to provide a more accurate representation of the conversations taking place in this arena, I have to admit that this was never really my interest going into this deep dive. Personally, I was always more concerned with the differences in the functional mechanisms of our brains, or in other words, the differences in how men and women receive, interpret, and process different inputs. Now, Dr. Elliott still refutes the claim that these functional differences exist. A last focus of the new study is on functional MRI. Across hundreds of studies, Dr. Elliott's team found extremely poor reliability in sex difference findings. Nearly all specific brain areas that differed in activity between men and women were not repeated across studies. But in my investigation, this is actually where I found the evidence to be overwhelmingly in support of the claim that these functional differences between our brains do in fact exist. And going back to the first article that we analyzed from the Stanford Medicine magazine, these functional differences were already alluded to in the experiment where the male and female brains were screened while watching emotionally aversive films, and distinct pattern divergence between the male and female brain was recognized. But this article from the National Academy of Sciences sums up my perspective better than I ever could. First, the author corroborates both Elliott's and Ritchie's research claiming that the male and female brains are not dimorphic, pointing to the fact that differences in morphology aren't an adequate measure of differences in functionality, which has a much higher level of predictability for behavior. MRIs are still images. Looking at these is more akin to examining a roadmap and drawing conclusions about traffic patterns. Whenever the terms female brain and male brain are used, the intention should be functional and not morphological. Quality qualitative and not quantitative. Functionally, brains of women and men are indeed different. Not better, not worse, neither more nor less sophisticated, just different. The very brain cells differ chromosomally. The male brain is exposed to a completely different hormonal environment during intrauterine life than the female brain. The available scientific data as to the crucial effect of testosterone on the developing male brain is overwhelming. The future effects of highly elevated testosterone in the male fetus are numerous, including behavioral characteristics, toy preferences, verbality, and many other features. And of course, these conclusions have been corroborated across multiple studies. This article from Psychology Today goes a little more in depth on the process of this exposure and the effects that it can have. The prenatal exposure to androgens masculinizes the brain in ways that influence psychological sex differences. There is substantial evidence that these effects are real. For instance, prenatal androgen exposure within normal levels predicts sex differences in postnatal play preferences. For example, rough and tumble play, personality traits, e.g. thrill-seeking and aggression, and cognitive abilities, like mental rotation ability. And of course, this mental rotation ability, or in other words, visuospatial ability, has been confirmed across a myriad of studies, including a few that we've already mentioned in this video. This peer-reviewed article submitted to the Physiology and Behavior Scientific Journal directly alludes to the correlation between functional brain differences and behavior in its abstract, explaining, since the individual functional differences in the brain in turn shape the behavior, sex-specific psychological/behavioral differences that can be observed in infants but also adults are consequently addressed. The National Institutes of Health also corroborated the link between brain sex differences and behavior, stating, in this review, we have focused on brain sex differences because of the role that they play in people's health and behavior. Historically, it was believed that such differences were solely due to gonadal hormone secretions. Yet, emerging research is also implicating direct genetic effects. And so across a multitude of studies, the link between sex differences in the brain and sex differences in behavior is being reinforced. Bringing us back to this article, which I believe makes some pretty apt comparisons in its conclusion that perfectly encapsulate the nature of our differences. Consider the heart, which is morphologically indistinguishable between the sexes. However, more women than men who suffer from a heart attack will have open coronary arteries and atypical symptoms. Consider drugs. Prophylactic aspirin taken by women will more often prevent strokes, and if taken by men, will more often prevent a heart attack. Consider the gastrointestinal system. Passage time of food and drugs will more often be longer in women than in men, with consequences for drug absorption and food digestion. All of this leading to the article's conclusion that most functional differences of our bodily systems are controlled by our functionally different brains. And yes, there is a female and a male brain. These comparisons demonstrate that other morphologically similar internal organs function differently in male and female bodies, and thus it is logical to conclude that our brains would function differently as well. And I have to admit that of all the articles and studies that I combed through in my investigation, this conclusion resonated with me the most, because it seemed to take into account all of the available data on the subject, while also reaffirming the stance that different does not mean better or worse in this regard. And this is an extremely important aspect of this discussion, because throughout history, proven inherent differences were often used as a foundation for labeling other groups as inferior. Much of the focus from those who refute the biological factors argument has been placed on combating what is now referred to as neurosexism. The term neurosexism was coined by feminist scholar Cordelia Fine and describes a bias in the neuroscience of sex differences towards reinforcing harmful gender stereotypes. And historically speaking, the biological factors argument has in fact been used to justify the suppression and exclusion of women from certain fields of study and profession. And so I think it makes complete sense as to why there is such an aversion to the notion that there are inherent differences between the male and female brain. As this article, written by cognitive scientist Scott Kaufman, explains, researchers who emphasize sociocultural factors in their research tend to conceptualize sex differences as small and worry that if we exaggerate the differences, then all manner of mayhem will break loose in society. Dr. Elliott herself has written extensively on the issue, and in her article titled Neurosexism, the Myth That Men and Women Have Different Brains, she cites a book written by cognitive neuroscientist Gina Rippin titled The Gendered Brain, the New Neuroscience That Shatters the Myth of the Female Brain. Rippin begins with an 1895 quote from social psychologist Gustave Le Bon, who used his portable cephalometer to declare that women represent the most inferior forms of human evolution. So as you can see, the fact that a woman's brain is on average smaller than a man's brain has been used to justify the degradation of the female sex for centuries. And so despite the fact that I tend to disagree with the conclusions of Dr. Elliott and her contemporaries, there is no denying that their aversion to the biological factors argument is completely justified. However, and this may just be reflective of my own investigation, but I did find that the majority of researchers who refute the biological factors argument were female, while the researchers who acknowledged and affirmed the biological factors argument were constituted of both male and female neuroscientists and psychologists. And I think this disparity disparity was reflected in the Pew Research Center survey, where we saw that the responses were split along gendered lines. I think part of the reason why women dispute the existence of innate biological differences is precisely because of the harmful ways that this argument has been used to marginalize and discriminate against them in the past. To them, that argument quite literally represents a justification for their oppression. The argument being that the reason women haven't achieved as much as men is because they are innately, genetically, and biologically inferior. And so I believe that it is completely understandable that women are wary of this argument. And as a black man, let me just say that I completely understand where they're coming from. Because it's not only the disparity between men's and women's brains that has been used to justify discrimination in the past. In the early 1800s, craniologist Samuel Morton measured hundreds, if not thousands, of human skulls to confirm his theory that the human race could be ranked on a scale of intelligence. And in his research, he concluded that of the races he studied, white people had the largest brains and black people had the smallest brains. Morton then used these findings as justification for the racial hierarchy that was already established in America at the time. A hierarchy that of course placed white people on the highest rung and viewed black people as nothing more than slaves. And beyond these findings, Morton and his subsequent followers used his research as evidence for polygenism, which is the theory that the various human races descended from separate origins, which ultimately means that Morton and his followers didn't even believe that black people were of the same species as white people. So yeah, this whole inherent biological differences argument is understandably very divisive. It has been used to subjugate and marginalize entire demographics for centuries, whether they were black people, women, or whoever the prevailing power sought to discriminate against at the time. And so I can understand why women today are so averse to this argument. But despite the horrific application of his conclusions, the fact remains that Morton's findings were scientifically accurate and his research was sound. Other scientists at the time, like German anatomist Friedrich Tiedemann, actually replicated his findings, but subsequently used these results to argue against slavery and in favor of abolition and equality between the races. And even today, studies confirm that, on average, black people's brains are smaller than white people's brains, which also happen to be smaller than Asian people's brains. And in what could possibly be described as neuroracism, these findings have been used to justify the disparity in IQ test results between the races. And so I agree with women in that we must remain vigilant against the nefarious application of these findings that ultimately seeks to establish hierarchies and subjugate entire demographics. But even as a black man who has had to deal with the negative implications that have resulted from this research, this doesn't mean that I have the right to dispute these findings altogether. The science, at least for now, seems to be irrefutable. And again, as many of the modern proponents of the biological factors argument have stated, all this means is that our brains are different. Not better, not worse, neither more nor less sophisticated, just different. And these differences will result in divergent behaviors, predispositions, and cognitive skills. And ultimately, coming back to this article, I find myself agreeing with Kaufman's perspective. I also believe that a truly mature, honest, and nuanced discussion of the origins of sex differences must recognize the deep influence of genetics and biology. That doesn't mean that we ignore sociocultural factors, which are clearly important, but sex differences in behavior are so pervasive in nearly every other species. It's just not plausible that somehow male and female psychology evolved to be identical, despite the physiological differences and different reproductive roles across human evolutionary history. And here, Kaufman brings up an important point about our evolutionary history, because even from an evolutionary standpoint, the evidence again seems to confirm the existence of innate biological differences. This article juxtaposes literary works from two female authors who reached vastly different conclusions regarding this topic. The first book is called Evolution and Gender: Why It Matters for Contemporary Life, and was written by Rosemary Hopcroft, a professor in sociology who used to think that men and women are equal and the same, but who has since renounced her, quote, youthful idea. Similar to Dr. Halpern from the Stanford Medicine article, Hopcroft believes that understanding average differences is key to the full realization of equality in healthcare and other dimensions of social life. In Hopcroft's view, understanding these differences with the help of evolutionary theory is a condition for the realization of equality, not an obstacle. The second book is called Inferior: How Science Got Women Wrong and the New Research That's Rewriting the Story, and was written by Angela Saini. As a matter of fact, this book was actually directly referenced by Dr. Lisa Elliott in her article on neurosexism. However, this article made sure to note that Evolution and Gender was positively reviewed in the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine, and received the Best Book Award from the Division on Evolution, Biology, and Society of the American Sociological Association. Meanwhile, Inferior has not been reviewed in scientific journals to date, but was praised in influential outlets such as The Guardian, The Independent, and Scientific American. Although, to be fair, I have also referenced work in this video from Scientific American, so being featured in that outlet in and of itself should not be seen as an indictment. However, of course, the fact that Inferior hadn't been recognized by any scholarly journals is notable. Nevertheless, Hopcroft's stance is clear. For her, both environment and evolved predispositions matter. Evolved predispositions exist in our genetic makeup as humans, but this does not mean that everything we do is determined by them. Behavior is always a product of a particular predisposition and the environment of the individual at the same time. And so the claim here is that our genetic makeup determines our predispositions, and that those predispositions have evolved over time. And of course, as always, proponents of the biological factors argument continue to acknowledge the importance of sociocultural impacts on our actions. And so Hopcroft concludes that it is the combination of these predispositions and our environments that shapes behavior. And also, very importantly, Hopcroft notes that these predispositions are not deterministic. It is not because you have a Y chromosome that you will inevitably engage in certain behaviors. You are just more predisposed to them. And funnily enough, it's actually Saini who seemingly inadvertently provides an example of an innate biological difference that actually highlights Hopcroft's point, noting that sexual jealousy and mate guarding are powerful biological drives seen throughout the animal kingdom, she suggested. If behavior like this had been exaggerated by humans, woven into society and culture, it might explain why women now appear to behave as modestly as they do. But the author notes that Saini saw patriarchy itself as the result of cultural evolution and as an outcome of historical and economic processes. And so the author reflects, since she acknowledged the biological drive that men have to jealously guard females from other males, an important question remains unanswered. Where did this biological drive come from? In addition, why is sexual jealousy more pronounced for men than for women? And hey, maybe I'm just being petty, but it seems that Saini is more than willing to acknowledge the existence of biological differences as long as they are being used to support her theory of patriarchy. But that's beside the point. In any case, Hopcroft has an answer to Saini's query. She points out a crucial difference between men and women. Only the latter are always 100% sure that the child that comes out of their womb is theirs. Due to paternity uncertainty, it is no wonder that, according to a cross-cultural study by Buss et al., no previous sexual experience in a prospective marriage partner was a more important criteria for men than for women. Again, confirming the assertion that innate biological differences have had an evolutionary effect on our psychology and predispositions, resulting in pronounced differences in the behaviors of men and women, differences that can't solely be explained by sociocultural factors and influences. And most importantly, Hopcroft makes sure to note that the affirmation of these biological predispositions does not mean that they should automatically be condoned or overlooked. She refers to this as the naturalistic fallacy, or the assumption that those who describe the reality of nature also consider that to be desirable. And on this note, both Hopcroft and this article's author agree that such a belief would be inadvisable. Here, I want to stress with Hopcroft that suggesting the existence of evolved predispositions for some traits does not make these traits acceptable. In my view, it is often by understanding the roots of our worst tendencies that we can learn to overcome them. And it is in this regard that I am in complete agreement with these studies and the purpose of their existence. I don't believe that we should be highlighting these differences with the intent to draw a line in the sand and give up on the process of trying to understand one another, as many influential figures would have us do. I believe that these differences should be highlighted for the purpose outlined here, to understand our roots. Understanding our genetic predispositions will help us to identify when and how we are succumbing to them, and will then allow us to decide whether or not to allow ourselves to, depending on the context. But if we aren't allowed to believe that these predispositions exist, or that our biological differences play a role in determining our behaviors, then we will only continue to attribute blame to a component of this equation that doesn't actually hold the responsibility. To put it bluntly, there are differences in our nature that changes to society simply cannot fix. And if we keep expecting it to, then we will only continue to fuel the already polarizing, hyperbolic, and divisive conversations concerning the differences between men and women. But in any case, I think that's going to be it for this one. If you made it this far, thank you so much for indulging me. I actually want to talk a lot more about the male-female dynamic in modern discourse, but obviously this one was already way too long, so I'm gonna have to make a part 2 and potentially even a part 3 to this, so stay tuned for those. But as always, thanks again for watching. I do hope this made sense, but of course, if it didn't, please feel free to let me know why so that I can try to address any misconceptions in the comments. But with that said, I wish you all the very best going forward. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.